I'm Major Elise Hartman, 36 years old, stationed at Fort Hood, Texas. On the night of December 14th, 2023, I walked into the officers' banquet hall wearing my dress uniform pressed to perfection, every ribbon polished until it caught the light. 200 officers and guests filled the room, the air thick with perfume bourbon and brass-polished pride. The annual officers' dinner was supposed to honor service and legacy. For me, it turned into a public execution of dignity. At our table sat my father, retired Colonel Raymond Hartman, 62, the man everyone in this hall still called the Legend of Fort Hood. He had trained half the people in that room. He'd trained me, too. He raised his glass high and boomed a toast about leadership, about legacy, about soldiers who never quit. His words floated over the clinking glasses like smoke proud and rehearsed. Then he looked at me. His eyes were glassy from whiskey, but sharp with that old disdain I knew too well. "My daughter thinks she's proven herself," he said loud enough for the next table to hear. A few heads turned. I felt the shift in the air, a ripple of curiosity. I smiled tightly, keeping my posture straight. He leaned closer, voice lower but edged with venom. "You're a bastard," he growled. It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but it was the first time in front of an audience. The laughter around us froze. For a second, no one breathed. Then he picked up a chicken bone from his plate, still slick with sauce, and tossed it onto mine. "That's about what you've earned," he said. The bone landed with a dull thud, grease staining the white linen. The room went utterly silent. I heard only the faint jazz playing from the stage and the buzz of the chandelier above. A captain at the next table shifted awkwardly. Someone coughed. Someone else pretended to check their phone. My father laughed a short, dry bark. "What's wrong, Major?" "Lost your command voice." My hands were still on the table, fingers curled slightly the way you do before you salute. I felt every muscle lock in place. Inside, something cracked open, but I kept my tone level. "Everyone will get what they deserve." "Colonel," I said quietly. The title, not Dad. He blinked, caught off guard by the calm in my voice. The silence stretched until it hurt. Then I stood, pushed my chair back slowly, and straightened my jacket. The sound of the chair legs scraping the floor cut through the hall like a blade. I looked around at the table once. The men and women who had called him mentor avoided my gaze. My father's smirk faltered. I could have shouted, thrown the glass, made a scene. Instead, I reached for my clutch turned and walked away. The heels of my shoes echoed across the marble floor, steady and sharp, each step a statement. Behind me, the conversations tried to restart a low murmur of forced normalcy. I could hear my father's voice again, laughing louder now, trying to pretend nothing had happened. But that laughter was the sound of a man standing on the edge without knowing it. As I reached the double doors, a waiter stepped aside, quickly, eyes wide. "Ma'am," he whispered. I nodded once and kept walking. Outside, the winter air hit like cold steel. The parking lot lights glared off the polished cars lined in perfect rows. My breath came out in tight clouds. I could still feel the grease of that bone on my plate like a stain that wouldn't wash away. I unlocked my car, slid inside, and sat for a long moment staring at my reflection in the windshield. The rank pins on my shoulders caught the glow from the street lamp. They looked heavier than ever. Inside the hall, a round of applause broke out late and hollow. Maybe he had started another toast. Maybe they were clapping to fill the silence I'd left behind. My phone buzzed with a message from my Aunt Marjorie. "He's been drinking again. Please don't let him drag you down." I read it twice, then turned off the screen. My hands trembled once, then steadied. I started the car, the engine humming low. In the mirror, I saw the banquet hall windows blazing with warm light, laughter leaking into the cold. I had spent years serving under his shadow, believing respect was earned by obedience. That night, I learned silence could be sharper than any command. As I drove away, the headlights carved 2 white lines across the empty road leading out of Fort Hood. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I just said softly to no one but the night, "Everyone will get what they deserve." And I meant it. Have you ever stayed silent when every part of you wanted to scream, "Tell me what you would have done"? The drive from Fort Hood to Killeen took 20 minutes, but that night it stretched like a lifetime. The December wind pushed against my car as if trying to hold me in place. The roads were slick from drizzle, the kind that blurred the reflection of the streetlights and made every mile feel lonelier. The hum of the tires was the only sound besides the faint rhythm of my own breathing. I replayed the scene over and over. The hall, the silence, the bone landing on my plate. The way my father's voice cut through laughter like a knife, raw and deliberate. No matter how many times I'd been on deployments, no explosion or command briefing had ever felt that loud. My chest was still tight, but my hands on the steering wheel were steady. Years in uniform had trained me for that control under pressure, composure, under humiliation. Yet nothing in my training manual had prepared me for being degraded by my own father in front of the people I commanded. Outside the windshield, the green exit sign for Colleen flickered past. I remembered the way the younger officers had looked at me when I stood up. Shock, sympathy, a few with quiet respect. But none of them would say a word. In the Army, silence was safety. The family name, Hartman, still meant something here, even if that name had just spat at me across a dinner table. The traffic lights blinked yellow at empty intersections. My reflection in the glass looked older than I remembered. 36 years had hardened my face, but tonight I saw a different kind of line, not from time, but from restraint. When I pulled into my driveway, the neighborhood was quiet rows of tidy duplexes where every lawn looked the same. I killed the engine, sat there for a moment, and listened to the tick of cooling metal. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in years, but I felt something hollow break loose inside me like a lock finally snapping open. The porch light cast a pale glow as I stepped out. My boots crunched on the gravel. The air smelled faintly of cedar and cold dust. I unlocked the front door, hung up my coat, and walked straight to the small wooden cabinet by the hallway. Inside was a framed photo, me in uniform, 24 years old, fresh from West Point, smiling too wide with my father's hand on my shoulder. His face in that picture was proud, almost gentle. I traced the glass with my thumb and whispered, "When did you start seeing me as the enemy?" The question hung in the air unanswered. In the kitchen, the clock ticked past midnight. I made tea without tasting it. The steam fogged the window, blurring the reflection of the medals displayed on the opposite wall. I had spent a lifetime trying to earn his approval through service, discipline, loyalty, the same virtues he'd taught me. But somewhere along the way, those virtues had turned into chains. My phone buzzed on the counter, the blue light cutting through the dark. A new message, Aunt Marjorie. Her subject line read simply, "Tonight." The email was short. "He's been drinking again, Elise. Please don't take his words to heart. You know how he gets. Stay strong." I stared at the screen until it dimmed, the message glowing faintly like a warning and a consolation all at once. My aunt had always tried to bridge the distance between us, but even she didn't understand how deep this went. This wasn't about whiskey or temper. It was about control, about a man who couldn't stand the idea that his daughter had outgrown him. The kettle whistled softly behind me. I turned it off and poured the water over the tea bag, watching the color bloom like smoke. The silence of the house felt heavier than any barracks I'd ever slept in. Every photo on the wall, promotion ceremonies, family holidays looked staged now, as if they belonged to someone else's life. I walked into my study. On the desk sat a framed certificate from the Fort Hood Family Service Recognition Program given to me last year for supporting base welfare projects. My father had attended that ceremony too, shaking my hand in front of the camera, smiling like the perfect parent. I picked up the frame, stared at the gold letters, and then set it down. My fingers tightened around the edge. One motion deliberate and slow, and the glass cracked down the center. The sound was sharp, satisfying. I slid the certificate out, tore it clean in half, then dropped both pieces into the trash. For years, I'd believed honoring the family name meant protecting it. Tonight, I understood that protecting it had meant protecting his lies. I leaned back against the wall, the soft whir of the ceiling fan the only sound. Outside, a police siren wailed faintly in the distance, fading as it passed the neighborhood. I closed my eyes, exhaled through my teeth, and whispered, "Enough." The word felt strange in my mouth, not angry, just final. In that moment, I made a quiet vow. No more shielding him. No more excuses. Whatever dignity he thought he owned, I would reclaim mine in silence first and in justice later. Tomorrow I would go back to work as if nothing had happened. But tonight I let the stillness be my witness. I didn't sleep that night. The house was quiet, but my mind was full of echoes from the banquet hall. Every sound came back with precision, the clinking of glass, the shift of uniforms, the hollow laugh that followed his insult. Around 3 in the morning I gave up trying to rest. I brewed another cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and stood by the window watching the empty street outside. The streetlights glowed against the fog, a kind of military order even in stillness. I thought about the faces in that room, men and women who had served with me, who had seen combat, who knew what it meant to hold a line under fire. Yet not one of them had said a word. I didn't blame them. Silence in the ranks wasn't cowardice, it was conditioning. We learned early that loyalty outranked truth and image outranked integrity. My father had taught that better than anyone. He built his reputation on it, but reputations were fragile, and last night his started to crack. I turned back toward my desk, the soft amber light catching on the medals and commendations lining the shelf. They used to mean everything, proof that I had done enough, been enough, made enough of him proud. But they looked smaller now, like relics of a life lived for someone else. I sat down and opened the drawer. Inside were old letters, performance reports, commendations signed by officers who once served under my father's command. His name appeared in the signature lines, his praise always formal, never personal. Exemplary service. Consistent with Army values. Never. I'm proud of you. I ran my finger across the ink, realizing how long I had accepted professionalism as affection. Somewhere in the quiet, I thought I heard my mother's voice, soft and steady. She had passed when I was 19, but her memory still lived in the smallest details, the scent of cedar polish on the furniture, the sound of classical piano she used to play after dinner, the way she'd smooth my hair before an exam. She had been the bridge between us, between his iron and my will. When she died, that bridge burned, and neither of us ever crossed to rebuild it. The clock read 4:07. Outside, the first light of dawn began to spread faintly over the rooftops. I poured another cup of coffee, set it on the windowsill, and grabbed my laptop. If I was going to stop pretending, I needed to face what came next. My inbox was cluttered with work emails, end-of-year logistics summaries, base memos. Then I saw one from the Family Service Board, an automated message reminding recipients to submit statements for the next quarter's recognition awards. The irony stung. Last night's humiliation would probably reach that committee by morning. Fort Hood ran on gossip as efficiently as on fuel. I could already imagine the whispers Major Hartman stormed out of the dinner. Colonel Hartman was drinking again. By noon, half the base would know. And for the first time, I didn't care. I closed the email, opened another tab, and drafted a simple message to Aunt Marjorie. I'm fine. I won't let him drag me down anymore. I need to make things right my way. I didn't specify what my way meant. I wasn't sure myself yet, but the act of typing it out made something inside me settle. I sent it and leaned back, feeling the first real quiet since I left the banquet hall. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. A text from Captain Torres, one of my junior officers who had been at the dinner. Ma'am, I'm sorry for what happened last night. Nobody should have seen that. I didn't know what to do. I stared at his words. It wasn't an apology for silence. It was a confession of helplessness. I typed back, "It's all right, Captain. You did the right thing by staying out of it. Sometimes silence says more than noise." He replied almost instantly. "He crossed a line, ma'am. Everyone knows it. That line I thought had been crossed years ago. The dinner just made it visible. The horizon outside was turning gold now, the Texas morning rising over the base like nothing had happened." I stood there for a moment, letting the sunlight spill across the room. Then I reached for the trash can, took out the torn certificate from last night, and burned the edges carefully over a candle. The paper curled, blackened, then crumbled into ash. I watched it disappear and felt the weight of a lifetime shift. That was the last token of obedience I'd ever kept. When the last ember went dark, I whispered to the empty room, "No more pretending." The words didn't echo. They landed softly and stayed. By 7, I was showered uniform, pressed ready for duty. To anyone at Fort Hood, I would look the same. Major Hartman, calm, precise, unshakable. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. I wasn't trying to be the daughter of Colonel Raymond Hartman anymore. I was just Elise, a soldier who had finally stopped fighting for his approval. And in that realization, there was power, quiet, steady, irreversible. I grew up in San Antonio in a house where the walls carried the rhythm of boots hitting tile, and the smell of starch and metal polish never left the air. My father kept the place like a barracks. Every morning at 6 sharp, the radio played the national anthem. Even after he retired, the routine stayed coffee black, bed corners folded tight, breakfast in silence. My mother, Caroline, used to joke that the Army had married us all. She'd laugh as she scrambled eggs, her voice light enough to soften the edges of his commands. For a while, it worked, until it didn't. My father had wanted a son. I knew that before I could spell my own name. I heard it in the pauses when people asked, "Just one child, Colonel," and he'd nod, smiling politely, but his jaw would tense. Just one, he'd say, "A girl." He loved me in his way, but it was the love of a commander expecting performance, not a parent offering warmth. By age 10, I knew how to march, how to salute, how to make a bunk so tight you could bounce a coin off the sheets. What I didn't know was how to disappoint him without feeling like I'd broken a rule of nature. When I was 12, he took me to a firing range. He corrected my stance so harshly I bit my lip to keep from crying. "Soldiers don't cry," he told me, lowering his voice just enough to make it a lesson, not comfort. "If you want respect, you earn it through control." I nodded, the metal taste of my own silence on my tongue. My mother had stood behind us that day, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. That night she told me softly, "You don't have to be him to survive him." I didn't understand what she meant until years later. When she died, everything in that house went quiet. I was 19, home from my second year at West Point, when I found him sitting at the kitchen table, the folded flag from her funeral beside a half-empty bottle. He didn't look up when I entered. He just said, "Finish your degree." That was his version of grief. At the funeral, he stood like a statue, face carved in marble, no tears, no tremor. I stood next to him and tried to do the same. When people offered condolences, he accepted them like medals. That night, I sat on the floor of my childhood room, surrounded by boxes of her clothes. The faint scent of her perfume clung to the air. Lilac and soap and something gentle. I cried until dawn. He never came upstairs. From then on, our conversations became transactions. Grades, career plans, military standards. Nothing personal, nothing real. The summer before graduation, I invited him to West Point. He declined. "I've already done that ceremony once in my life," he said. "I don't need to watch another." That was his way of reminding me I was a reflection, not an individual. I remember calling my Aunt Marjorie that night, choking back tears. She told me, "He doesn't know how to love outside of command." I wanted to believe that made it forgivable, but it didn't. I graduated anyway, saluting the empty space where he should have stood, the applause of strangers filling the void. My first posting was back in Texas at Fort Hood. When the assignment came through, I thought maybe fate was giving us a chance to reconnect. He lived just 2 hours away. But connection wasn't what he wanted. Supervision was. Every visit felt like an inspection. He'd look over my reports, critique my tone, tell me what my subordinates should think of me. A Hartman doesn't bend, he'd remind me. "You have to be tougher than the men you lead." I'd nod, even as something inside me tightened. He wasn't raising me anymore, but he was still commanding me. When storms hit Fort Hood in 2015 and we were sent on emergency rescue duty, I led a convoy into flooded roads near Belton Lake. A truck overturned, and one of my soldiers was trapped beneath it. I went in myself, waist deep in freezing water, cutting his seatbelt with my field knife until we pulled him free. By the time we got him to safety, my uniform was soaked and my hands shaking. News spread through the base within hours. I received a commendation, a handshake from the base commander, and a message from my father that simply read, "You did what any soldier should do. No congratulations. No pride." Just a rule, a reminder that heroism was expected, not celebrated. That single sentence killed whatever hope I had left for reconciliation. From then on, I treated him like a superior officer I no longer reported to with respect, but from a distance. Yet some nights when I'd catch the sound of rain against the barracks roof, I'd still think of him in that kitchen coffee cup in hand, surrounded by medals and silence, unable to say he'd lost the only person who ever softened him. Maybe that was the real tragedy. He didn't hate me because I was a daughter. He resented me because I was the part of my mother that survived. The older I grew, the more our conversations became rehearsed performances, as if we were actors reading from the same outdated script. His lines never changed: discipline, honor, reputation. Mine became replies crafted to avoid explosion. I learned to anticipate his tone, to sense the drop in his voice before criticism came. Every call felt like a tactical maneuver, not a father-daughter exchange. After each talk, I'd stare at my phone and wonder if this was what loyalty was supposed to feel like: exhaustion dressed as duty. There were small moments when I thought I saw something human in him, but they vanished too quickly to matter. On Veterans Day in 2018, I organized a memorial event at Fort Hood to honor fallen soldiers. He came, stood at the back of the crowd, arms crossed, not clapping, not smiling, just watching. When it was over, he walked up, looked at me, and said, "You speak well. Your posture's improved." Then he turned and left. I told myself that was praise. It was the only kind I would ever get. Over the years, people who knew him spoke about the colonel as if he were carved from granite. They admired his discipline, his unshakable standards, his service record. They called him old school honorable, the backbone of command. And maybe he was to them. But to me, he was a man terrified of anything that couldn't be ordered into obedience. My mother had once told me that he didn't know how to love anything he couldn't control. I didn't understand that until I saw him flinch when I disagreed with him, not because I was wrong, but because I had a voice. When he remarried a few years after my mother's death, I tried to be supportive. His new wife, Linda, was kind enough, quiet, and careful around him, as though she'd studied the terrain and knew where not to step. She treated me with politeness that felt like apology. I visited once for Christmas. The tree was perfect. The ornaments color coordinated, the presents arranged in symmetrical rows. He'd even hung a photo of me in uniform on the mantel next to one of himself in dress blues. When I noticed it, he said, "Presentation matters." Not pride. Presentation. That was the closest he ever came to saying he was proud of me. When I left that evening, Linda hugged me goodbye. She whispered, "He's proud. He just doesn't know how to show it." I smiled because it was easier than explaining that I didn't need his pride anymore. What I needed was peace. In 2020, during the height of the pandemic, he called unexpectedly. It was late, close to midnight. His voice sounded older, thinner, like the edges had worn down. "You're still at Fort Hood?" he asked. I said yes. There was a long pause. Then he said, "Take care of yourself." Before I could reply, he hung up. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen, unsure if that had been an attempt at affection or another command. Maybe both. I didn't hear from him again for months, but that call stayed with me, a reminder that even distance couldn't untangle us completely. Sometimes trauma binds tighter than love. A year later, a hurricane hit the Gulf Coast, and I was part of a logistics unit deployed to assist civilian evacuations. It was chaos, long days of exhaustion and constant risk, but when the job was done, my name appeared in a report praising my leadership. Someone sent him the article. I know because 2 weeks later, a letter arrived in my mailbox, written in his distinct, rigid handwriting. "Elise, your mother would have been proud. Don't let it get to your head. Remember, humility keeps a soldier grounded." I kept that letter not because of the words, but because it was the only time he'd ever mentioned my mother and pride in the same breath. Still, even that felt like he couldn't let me have the win without a leash attached. When I reread it later, I realized every sentence he ever said to me carried the same weight praise that came with a warning approval that cost obedience. Over time, I stopped waiting for warmth and settled for acknowledgement. It wasn't love, but it was something. And yet, beneath all the resentment, there was still that thread of empathy. He had been raised the same way he raised me, molded by orders and silence. His father, my grandfather, had been a drill sergeant who drank too much and spoke too little. The pattern repeated like a family tradition nobody wanted, but everyone inherited. I saw it clearly one night as I looked through my mother's old photo album. There was one picture of my father in his 20s standing beside my grandfather outside an airbase in Georgia. They looked identical. Same jaw, same rigid stance, same eyes that refused to soften for the camera. I remember whispering to the photo, "You never stood a chance, did you?" Maybe that's why I couldn't completely hate him. I understood the chain of command that built him the generations of men who mistook control for love. But understanding didn't mean forgiving. I could empathize with the wound and still refuse to bleed for it. The last real conversation we had before the officers' dinner was about a soldier under my command who'd made a mistake on a training exercise. I told him I'd chosen to discipline the man privately, not file an official reprimand. He frowned. "You're getting soft," he said. "The Army doesn't reward compassion." I looked at him across the table and replied, "Maybe that's why you never got promoted past colonel." For a second, his eyes flared not with anger, but shock. I had crossed the invisible line I'd spent a lifetime respecting. He didn't reply. He just stood, walked to the window, and said, "You sound more like your mother every day." It was the closest thing to love he ever gave me, and the last moment of peace we would ever share before everything shattered. The morning after the dinner, I woke to the vibration of my phone on the nightstand. The room was still half-dark light filtering weakly through the blinds. My head throbbed from lack of sleep, the kind of fatigue that comes from holding too much inside. I didn't have to check the caller ID to know who it was. The tone of the ring felt like him steady, commanding, impatient. I let it buzz twice before answering. "Major Hartman," I said automatically, voice steady out of habit. There was a pause, then his voice came through rough but clear. "You embarrassed me last night walking out like that." No greeting, no hesitation. Just accusation. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the chill of the air against my skin. "You embarrassed yourself," I said quietly. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through the line. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, or at least try to disguise his anger behind some officer's discipline. Instead, he exhaled through his teeth that sound he made when he was barely holding back rage. "You disrespected your family name. You made a scene in front of my colleagues." His voice rose with each word, the clipped rhythm of a man used to commanding silence. "Do you even understand what that looked like?" "Yes," I said. It looked like truth finally showing up in a room full of lies. There was a faint click. He'd hung up. No goodbye, no warning, just the familiar punishment of silence. I stared at the phone for a long time before setting it down. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Outside the neighborhood, kids were leaving for school, their laughter a faint echo of normal life. I made coffee and drank it black, standing by the window. I'd expected the anger. I hadn't expected the humiliation to spread so fast. By midday, I got the first message from a colleague. "Hey, just checking in. Everything okay after last night?" Another one followed. "Ignore the noise, people talk too much." My stomach tightened. I opened my social media app, something I rarely did, and there it was, his post. Just a few lines, but enough to light a fire. Some people forget who trained them. Legacy means nothing to those who only want attention. The words sat on the screen like landmines. No names, no direct accusation, but everyone would know exactly who he meant. The comments rolled in old officers from his generation, younger soldiers who still idolized him, people who'd never met me but admired him from his war stories. Preach colonel. That's the problem with this generation. No loyalty. Disrespecting a man who built her career. Shame. I scrolled until the words started to blur. My name wasn't there, but it didn't need to be. The narrative was already written: the ungrateful daughter, the arrogant officer, the one who couldn't handle authority. I closed the app and put the phone face down on the counter. For years, I'd learned to stay calm under fire, but this wasn't a battlefield I could control. This was character assassination wrapped in nostalgia. I thought about calling him again, demanding he take it down, but I knew better. That post wasn't for me. It was for his audience, his old comrades, his admirers, his echo chamber of men who'd built their identities around being unchallenged. I sat at the kitchen table, tracing the edge of my coffee mug, trying to find something solid to hold on to. My reflection in the window looked like someone else, someone tired of playing the perfect officer. A knock sounded at the door. It was Captain Torres again, holding a file. "Morning, ma'am," he said awkwardly. I thought you might want to see this before it circulates further. He handed me a printout, a screenshot of my father's post shared by another officer from the base group chat. It had already been reposted 5 times. Underneath, someone had written, "Guess discipline skips a generation." My throat tightened, but I forced a small nod. "Thank you, Captain." He hesitated. "People respect you, ma'am. They know what kind of soldier you are." "Do they?" I asked, eyes on the paper. "Or do they just respect the louder story?" He didn't answer. I folded the printout and slid it into a drawer. "Dismissed, Captain," I said softly. He saluted and left. When the door clicked shut, I sat in the silence again, listening to the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall. My father had always said reputation was everything. What he never understood was that control of the story could be a weapon too, and this time he'd drawn first blood. That afternoon, the air at Fort Hood felt heavier than usual. The December sun was sharp but cold, glinting off the rows of parked Humvees like a warning. I walked across the training yard to my office, keeping my posture steady, eyes forward, the way soldiers are trained to move when everyone is watching. I could feel the stares, subtle but real, the kind that linger half a second too long before sliding away. In every nod, every polite morning ma'am, I could hear the unspoken question, "Is it true?" By noon, the rumors had evolved beyond recognition. Some said I had screamed at my father. Others claimed I'd thrown a glass that I'd caused a scene. In the military, a story only needs half a fact to grow legs. I kept working as if nothing had changed, reviewing logistics reports, signing requisitions, answering calls about end-of-year rotations. But the silence in the hallways told me everything I needed to know. They weren't just seeing me as Major Hartman anymore. I was now the daughter of the Colonel's scandal. Around 3 p.m., my inbox pinged with a message from the Public Affairs Office. The subject line read, "Clarification on social media commentary." The email was polite, procedural, and surgical, a reminder to be mindful of online narratives that may reflect on command integrity. They didn't say your father's post, but they didn't have to. I closed the laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He'd managed to do it again. Turn the story control, the optics make himself the victim before anyone else could think otherwise. I could almost hear his voice low and deliberate. "Perception is power, Elise. The one who speaks first sets the truth." I used to think he meant it as advice. Now I saw it as a confession. That evening I called my Aunt Marjorie. Her voice came through the line, soft but weary. "I saw his post," she said. "He's not himself lately." "He's exactly himself," I replied. "He just doesn't have Mom to make him look better anymore." There was a pause. "You're not wrong," she said quietly. "But don't let this become a war. You can't win against a man who fights by rewriting history." "Then I'll change the battlefield," I said. She didn't ask what I meant. She just sighed, the kind of sigh that carried years of family fatigue. "He'll come around, Elise. He always does." I wanted to believe her, but deep down I knew better. My father didn't come around. He conquered or erased. The next morning, I stopped by the base cafe for coffee. 2 officers from logistics sat near the window, whispering, their voices dropping the moment they saw me. One of them smiled awkwardly. "Morning, Major." I nodded. "Morning, gentlemen." I didn't need to ask what they were talking about. Reputation spreads faster than truth. As I stirred the coffee, my reflection shimmered in the stainless steel counter. I looked composed, precise, every hair in place, uniform, immaculate. But beneath the surface, a quiet fury brewed, controlled and measured. Back at my office, Brenda stopped by. She was my closest friend at the base, pragmatic and sharp, with the kind of insight that cut through military politics like a blade. She shut the door behind her and crossed her arms. "I'm guessing you've seen the post." "I have," I said. "And the fallout." "He's playing the victim," she said bluntly. "And it's working. People worship him. He's the colonel who built Fort Hood's honor. No one's going to believe you unless you have proof he's not that man." I met her eyes. What kind of proof? The kind he can't spin? Her words lingered, heavy with implication. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, a convoy rumbled by engines, humming like a low heartbeat. "You know," she said softly, "it's almost poetic. He taught you how to survive a battlefield. He just never realized you'd use those lessons against him." I'm not fighting him, I said. Not yet. She smiled faintly. No, you're planning. That's worse for him. When she left, I sat alone, her words echoing in my mind. Proof he can't spin. The phrase sank deep, planting itself like a seed. I looked at the framed commendations on my wall, every one of them tied to his influence, his shadow. I wondered how many of those victories had truly been mine. The sun dipped lower, turning the windows gold. My phone buzzed again, another notification, another share of his post. It had reached over 100 reactions now, a thread of comments painting me as the wayward soldier who'd disrespected her own blood. I turned the phone face down and took a deep breath. The humiliation wasn't new. It was just louder now, amplified by screens and names and invisible judgment. But beneath the sting, something else stirred the cold, familiar clarity that came before every mission. This wasn't the end of my reputation. It was the beginning of his reckoning. I just needed patience, the kind he'd always mistaken for weakness. I was halfway through reviewing supply reports when my phone rang again, the kind of call that carried a presence before the first word. The name flashing on the screen made me straighten instinctively. Colonel Avery Monroe Rhett. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 6 months. The man had once been my commanding officer, my field mentor, and the only superior who had ever treated me like a person before a rank. His voice came through steady gravelly with age, but sharp as ever. Major Hartman, he said, using my title out of respect, not habit. You've had a hell of a week. I exhaled slowly. You could say that, sir. Don't call me sir anymore, he said. I left the salutes behind when I turned in my uniform. I allowed myself the smallest smile. Then what do I call you? Call me Avery. You earned that right. His tone softened, but not by much. I heard about your father, the post, the dinner. Hell, everyone's heard. You okay? It was the kind of question soldiers ask without expecting an honest answer. I paused before replying. I'm fine. No, he said, you're functioning. That's different. Silence stretched between us, the kind that comes when someone can read your thoughts too easily. Finally, he sighed. Listen to me carefully, Elise. I've known Raymond Hartman a long time. Brilliant officer, terrible father. He believes control equals loyalty. You embarrassed him in public and now he's building his counterattack. You can't stop him by shouting louder. You'll have to outthink him. I'm not looking for revenge, I said quietly. Good, he replied. Then you might actually stand a chance at winning. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. He's using his reputation, the same one that helped me get where I am. That's the problem with legacy, Avery said. It's a medal until it becomes a shackle. You've been wearing his version of you for years. Time to write your own. And how exactly do I do that, I asked. First rule, he said. If you fight, don't fight angry. Fight smart. Collect facts, not feelings. His words settled deep, heavy, and grounding. Second rule, he continued. Document everything. Every time he's used his name to pull your strings, every favor he called in, every file he tampered with. You can't change the narrative without evidence. I stared at the laptop screen at the open spreadsheet filled with numbers that suddenly seemed irrelevant compared to what he was saying. That'll take time. Then you'd better start now, he said. And one more thing. Don't tell anyone what you're doing, not yet. The less they know, the cleaner your line of fire. Line of fire. I repeated the phrase, tasting familiar, like coming home. You always were his daughter, he said, half amused. But the difference is, you still know when to stop pulling the trigger. When the call ended, I sat in silence, staring at the wall where sunlight filtered through the blinds, striping the room in gold and shadow. My anger, sharp and restless the day before, began to settle into something colder, strategic. I opened a new document on my computer and typed at the top Hartman interventions, observed and verified. The first memory that surfaced was small, almost forgotten. 2012, my first field command. A reassignment order had been delayed because of paperwork discrepancies. A week later, my father called and said, "Fixed it. You'll thank me later." I hadn't questioned him then. I had thanked him. I wrote it down now. Then another 2016. A disciplinary note from a superior officer that mysteriously disappeared from my file after he spoke with the right people. I'd told myself it was luck. It wasn't. I kept typing each line heavier than the last. By the time I reached 10 entries, my hands had stopped shaking. For years, I'd thought I owed him everything: my career, my credibility, my footing in the army. But looking at that list, I realized what he had really given me was dependence disguised as protection. The realization didn't sting. It clarified. I closed the document, saved it under a coded name, and exhaled. The fear that usually followed defiance didn't come. For the first time, I felt nothing but calm. The kind of calm that precedes a plan. Over the next few days, I followed Avery's advice like orders. Every evening after finishing my regular reports, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by folders, printed emails, and memory sticks labeled with years and units. The house felt quieter than usual, the only sound the soft buzz of the ceiling fan and the faint hum of the base sirens in the distance. I went through everything with the precision of a logistics audit, not out of anger anymore, but out of discipline. Each memory that had once made me feel powerless now served as a data point, a piece of evidence in a larger pattern I hadn't seen before. I wrote down dates, names, units, and incidents. The time he called a general at Fort Benning to fast-track my assignment. The call he made to a senator's aide to secure a transfer for one of his protégés who had failed an evaluation. The anonymous letter of recommendation that mirrored his writing style perfectly. One by one, they stopped being stories and became records. The more I wrote, the lighter I felt, as if every entry stripped away a layer of control he had built around me. By the end of the third night, I had compiled 26 entries, each one corroborated by an email message or document. It wasn't a vendetta list. It was history, the kind that didn't make it into speeches or plaques. I saved the file again, printed a copy, and locked it inside a folder labeled Avery Notes, hidden beneath training manuals in my drawer. The next morning, I met Avery at a diner off base, the kind of place where no one wore uniforms, but everyone carried the same posture, straight backs, quiet eyes, the residue of command. He was already there when I arrived, stirring his coffee slowly, his silver hair tucked neatly beneath a black cap that read Army Strong. He looked up as I approached. "You look better," he said. Lighter. I sat down across from him. "I slept." "Then you're already ahead of most soldiers." "I know," he said. We ordered breakfast eggs, black coffee toast, neither of us touched. He leaned back, studying me. "So, what have you found?" I handed him the folder. He flipped through a few pages, his expression neutral. When he reached the middle, he paused, his brows furrowing slightly. "He covered your tracks for years," he said. "You realize that means he technically protected you." "Protected me," I echoed. "Or positioned me." He nodded slowly. "Both. To him, they're the same thing." He set the papers down. "You're sitting on a record that could tarnish his entire career, Elise. What do you plan to do with it? I don't know yet," I said. "But I know I'm done being afraid of what happens if I don't protect him." Avery's gaze softened. "Good answer. Just remember, exposure is a weapon that cuts both ways. If you use it too early, you'll look like the bitter child. Too late, and the truth will drown in nostalgia. So when's the right time?" "When his power depends on silence," he said. "That's when truth hurts the most." The way he said it reminded me of tactical briefings. Identify the terrain, assess the timing strike only when the advantage is absolute. This wasn't revenge. It was strategy. I realized then why he'd called me not to comfort me, but to remind me of the rules of engagement. "Elise," he said, lowering his voice, "your father built a career on command and fear. You'll never win by outshouting him. Win by proving what he's afraid of, that you don't need his name anymore." I nodded, the words sinking deep. He smiled faintly. "You always had her steadiness," he said, meaning my mother. He never did. I left the diner with the morning sun in my eyes, the sky over Killeen, pale and clear. On the drive back, I caught myself gripping the wheel differently, not tight with tension, but firm with resolve. That night, I began a second list, not of his wrongs, but of my wins. The missions led successfully, the soldiers promoted under my command. The commendations that had nothing to do with his influence. It was shorter, but it was mine. I realized something as I wrote the last line. The story I'd lived so far wasn't about him anymore. It was about me learning the difference between obedience and integrity. I sent Avery a text before going to bed. "Thank you for the clarity." He replied minutes later. "Clarity is step 1. Step 2 is precision. You're almost there." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed, then whispered into the dark. "If you fight, don't fight angry. Fight smart." For the first time in years, those words didn't sound like advice. They sounded like permission. The storm began quietly, the way most betrayals do not, with an explosion, but a whisper. 3 days after meeting Avery, I walked into the office to find the usual rhythm disrupted. Conversations stopped when I passed. Laughter faded halfway through sentences. No one said anything directly, but the air had changed. Even silence has tone, and this one carried something poisonous. Around noon, Lieutenant Harris, one of the younger officers from logistics, appeared at my door. He looked hesitant, shifting the folder in his hands as if deciding whether to hand it over. "Major," he said carefully, "I thought you should see this. It's circulating in the internal group chat." I motioned for him to come in. He placed a printed sheet on my desk and stepped back like he'd dropped contraband. It was a transcript fragments of a conversation pulled from a thread of officers, some still serving, others retired. The first message froze my breath. She didn't earn that promotion. Everyone knows she had help special favor from upstairs. Raymond pulled strings again. Another name replied when I recognized instantly. It wasn't rumor. It was a direct quote from my father. A father can only cover for his daughter so long. Sooner or later, the Army sees what's real. I stared at the words until they blurred. The room tilted not from shock, but from confirmation. This was the shape of his retaliation, slow, calculated humiliation. Harris cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I don't know who leaked it, but people are talking. Some think it's not real. Others—" He stopped himself. "Others I asked. Others think he's trying to protect his reputation," he said quietly. "That maybe the dinner wasn't what it looked like." I nodded, folding the paper once then again until the words disappeared. "Thank you, Lieutenant. You didn't see this." "Understood, yes, ma'am." He saluted and left relief visible in his shoulders. I waited until the door shut before letting out the breath I'd been holding. It wasn't surprise that hit me. It was something colder recognition. I had spent my entire life learning my father's strategies, his use of authority, his mastery of public narrative. He was predictable in his perfectionism. When cornered, he didn't fight the truth, he rewrote it. I opened my laptop and logged into the same officers' forum. The thread was still active. Some comments defended me, most didn't. The phrase "special favor" repeated like a stain across the page. I scrolled past dozens of responses until I saw his username again. "Discipline starts at home." Some people forget that. No one needed context. Everyone knew who he meant. I closed the page and sat very still. The humiliation from the dinner had been personal. This was professional. He wasn't just attacking me anymore. He was dismantling my credibility, the one thing a soldier couldn't lose. For a long time, I just listened to the faint buzz of the fluorescent light above. Then I did what Avery had taught me. I started recording. Every chat log, every comment, every timestamp. I took screenshots, saved links, stored them in a locked drive. It wasn't revenge. It was insurance. That night, I received a text from Brenda. "You might want to check your messages on the contractor's board. Something's being said." I opened the link. A new post this time from a civilian contractor connected to the base supply chain. It accused me of favoritism in procurement reviews. It even listed the date of a project I'd supervised. I read it twice, then felt the pattern click into place. He wasn't just attacking me through the Army's rumor mill, he was reaching into civilian circles, planting shadows where his influence still lingered. I rubbed my temples, exhaustion fighting clarity. This wasn't just pride anymore. It was desperation. He was trying to erase me from the institution he'd spent his life defining. Later that evening, I poured a drink I didn't finish and scrolled through old photos, award ceremonies, briefings, base events. Each one a moment of pride that now looked staged. Then, as I clicked through an archived news folder, I stopped. There. He was, my father, at a formal dinner months ago, standing beside a man I recognized instantly. Thomas Rourke, a defense contractor currently under federal investigation for procurement bribery. The same man I had flagged in a report last year. My pulse quickened. The caption read, "Ret. Colonel Raymond Hartman attends Veteran Sponsorship Gala Dallas TX." Their handshake was firm, their smiles polished. I enlarged the image until the pixels blurred. There it was, the connection that tied his campaign of slander to something bigger. The dinner, the post, the rumors, all part of a pattern. I closed the laptop slowly, my reflection ghosted in the black screen. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. The kind of awake you don't come back from. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The image of my father shaking hands with Thomas Rourke still burned into my mind. The picture wasn't proof on its own, but it confirmed what instinct had already whispered. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. He was protecting something. Maybe a deal, maybe a reputation built on alliances that couldn't withstand scrutiny. Either way, he'd chosen to destroy his daughter's name to save his own. I brewed coffee and sat at the table with my laptop opening every document I'd saved, cross-referencing dates and events. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. The gala in Dallas coincided with the same week Rourke's firm won a logistics supply renewal that had bypassed a mandatory compliance audit. That audit had been assigned to my division before my father publicly questioned my integrity. I leaned back, the timeline unfolding like a map. This wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration. By framing me as compromised, he'd discredited the one person positioned to expose him. The irony might have been impressive if it hadn't been my life unraveling in the process. Around 7, my phone buzzed. Brenda's name flashed across the screen. Her voice came through sharp and worried. "Elise, it's spreading again. Someone leaked the internal memo about Rourke's contracts. They're saying you were part of the review team." I said, my voice flat. "Then, you need to see what's attached to it. Check your email." I opened my inbox. The subject line hit me like a gut punch. Conflict of interest allegation. Internal inquiry pending. The message was from base administration, a formal notification that an anonymous report had accused me of bias in procurement oversight. It wasn't a real investigation yet, but the optics were enough to stain my record. My father hadn't just attacked me online. He'd built an entire framework to make me look guilty on paper. "Brenda," I said quietly. "Who forwarded this?" "I don't know," she said. "But whoever filed this complaint used official channels. It's clean. Looks procedural." I closed my eyes. He's covering his tracks with regulation. That's his genius. He never breaks the rules. He just bends them until they serve him. "You need to protect yourself," she said. "You need to fight back." "I will," I said, but not the way he expects. After hanging up, I sat there in the stillness of the room, the hum of the refrigerator steady as my thoughts aligned. This wasn't humiliation anymore. It was war disguised as bureaucracy. I spent the next hours collecting every piece of correspondence linked to Rourke's contracts, meeting minutes, inspection checklists, even sign-in logs. Most of them were mundane signatures, timestamps, initials, but small details stood out. My father's name appeared 3 times as an honorary consultant in post-retirement advisory notes. That title meant nothing officially, but it gave him access to restricted discussions. Access he shouldn't have had. The realization struck like cold water. He wasn't just defending Rourke. He might have been part of the deals themselves. I checked the image metadata from the Dallas Gala photo I'd saved the night before. It had been uploaded by a PR firm connected to Rourke's company, timestamped 2 weeks after the internal report I'd written on procurement irregularities. My stomach turned. That was the proof Avery had told me to look for the moment his power depended on silence. And he'd built that silence by tearing down mine. I forwarded the photo to my secure drive, renamed it Cement Line, then printed 2 copies. One went into my locked file at home. The other slid into the inner pocket of my uniform jacket. I didn't know when I'd use it, but I would. By noon, whispers on base had evolved into a storm. People stopped making eye contact. The word investigation had a way of infecting trust. I walked through the hallway with measured calm, aware that every salute now came with a question mark. When I reached my office, there was another message waiting, this time from an unknown address. No greeting, no signature. Just a single line: "You shouldn't have crossed him." I stared at it, my pulse steady, not afraid, but alert. I took a screenshot, saved it, and deleted the message. He was escalating. That meant he was nervous. That meant I was getting closer. That evening, I stood on my balcony overlooking the dark streets of Killeen, the Texas Air Dry, and Electric. Somewhere out there, he was still moving pieces, still trying to shape the story. But what he didn't know was that his story was now part of mine, documented, dated, traceable. For years, he'd taught me to fight with precision. Now he'd see what precision looked like when pointed back at him. The sky above Fort Hood flickered with distant lightning, silent and brief, like the start of a reckoning. The storm outside had passed, but the one in my head hadn't. The next morning began like any other reports, inspections, the daily blur of routine that keeps soldiers from thinking too long about their private wars. By mid-afternoon, I was in my office finalizing inventory logs when Brenda walked in without knocking. One look at her face and I knew something was wrong. She shut the door quietly, locked it, and dropped a folder on my desk. "You need to see this," she said, her voice low and tight. I frowned. What am I looking at? Training fund records from the old 14th Logistics Unit, the one your dad oversaw before retirement. "That was 5 years ago," I said. "Why are you looking at those?" "Because procurement audits link back further than that," she said, flipping the folder open. "And because I found something that shouldn't exist." She pointed to a column of transactions highlighted in yellow. "See these monthly transfers from a sub-account labeled Hartman Foundation, about $4,000 a month, steady for years. The problem is that Foundation isn't on any official list." I blinked, my chest tightening. The Hartman Foundation. The name hit like a stone, dropped into still water. He set that up years ago after Mom died. Said it was for scholarships, community outreach, something to honor her. Brenda nodded slowly. "That's what I thought, too. But look closer at the source of funds." I leaned over the pages. Each transaction originated from vendor accounts tied to supply contracts, uniforms, field rations, even vehicle maintenance, all under Fort Hood jurisdiction. "These are government contracts," I said quietly. "Exactly," Brenda replied. "And the routing numbers show money diverted through third-party suppliers. The transfers were disguised as consulting fees. Classic laundering pattern." My throat went dry. "You're saying he's been taking kickbacks?" "Not directly," she said. "He built a foundation to do it for him. Keeps his name clean while funds move under the guise of charity. It's elegant if you ignore the ethics." I stared at the folder as if it might vanish if I blinked. My father's voice echoed in memory, his lectures about honor discipline, the Army Code. He'd worn his medals like shields, convincing everyone that integrity ran in his veins. "How long has this been happening?" I asked. "At least 7 years, Brenda said. I traced the earliest one to 2016. Guess what else happened that year I didn't have to guess? That was the year I was promoted to captain, the same year he began publicly taking credit for my growth as a leader. He used my name," I whispered. Brenda nodded. "To legitimize his image. The timing lines up too perfectly. The foundation got more donors every time you got a new rank." I sank into my chair, the air suddenly too heavy to breathe. "Does anyone else know?" "Not yet," she said. "But Elise, this isn't gossip. This is criminal. If CID or the Inspector General finds it first, it won't matter that you weren't involved. You'll be dragged through it too." I rubbed my temples, trying to think. My father's public attacks now made sense. They weren't random humiliation. They were preemptive. He'd been setting up a narrative where I looked corrupt before anyone could connect him to the real thing. "He knew this was coming," I said quietly. "He saw the walls closing in." Brenda hesitated, then said softly, "Elise, you can't protect him from this. You can't protect someone who built the fire you're standing in." I looked up at her. "I'm not trying to protect him. I'm trying to understand how I became part of his cover story." For a moment, the room was silent except for the ticking clock. My pulse matched its rhythm, steady but relentless. "We need evidence," I said finally. "All of it. Bank statements, vendor records, anything that links the foundation to his name." Brenda nodded. "I'll help, but you have to promise me something." "What?" "That you'll stay detached. Don't let this turn into another emotional mission. This isn't about revenge." I almost laughed. It never was. It's about truth. She gave a small, sad smile. You sound like a soldier again. Maybe I'm remembering what that means, I said. When she left, I sat staring at the folder for a long time. My mother's name was printed across the foundation letterhead, in memory of Claire Hartman. I remembered the photo of her in uniform smiling in sunlight, her eyes soft but steady. She'd been the conscience of our family. I wondered what she'd say if she knew what her legacy had become. Probably something simple, something she used to tell me as a child. The truth doesn't need a uniform. My father had used her memory as camouflage, and for years I had believed it. The heartbreak wasn't just about what he'd done, it was about what I hadn't seen. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, Fort Hood glowed under the late afternoon sun, orderly, disciplined, indifferent. Soldiers walked in formation, unaware that somewhere behind those walls honor had been traded for convenience. I pressed my palm to the glass, whispering, "Not anymore." That night, I created a new encrypted folder on my laptop titled Foundation Data. Then I began scanning every document, labeling, cross-referencing, and backing it up to 3 separate drives. By midnight, my hands were trembling, not from fear, but from focus. The pieces were coming together, and so was I. The following days blurred into one long, meticulous operation. Every hour outside of duty became part of a quiet investigation, not sanctioned, not official, but necessary. I worked like a machine, driven not by anger, but by precision. I spent nights cross-checking data, tracing routing numbers, identifying every vendor that had moved money through the so-called Hartman Foundation. Each new discovery deepened the weight in my chest, yet sharpened my focus. Brenda and I communicated only in person, avoiding phones, avoiding emails. In the military, privacy is an illusion, and I wasn't about to tip him off. On the 3rd night, she arrived at my apartment carrying a flash drive sealed in a small plastic bag. "You'll want to see this," she said. I plugged it into my laptop, the screen filling with spreadsheets, rows of transactions, coded comments, and approval initials. But one line near the bottom stopped me cold. Consultation fee, $18,000. Approver, R. Hartman. Brenda pointed at it. That's his digital signature. It's embedded in the metadata. He approved it personally. For what purpose, I asked, though I already knew the answer. The memo line says Equipment Allocation Assessment. But the funds went to a company registered in Nevada, a shell corp that doesn't exist outside a mailbox. I verified it. I leaned back, eyes closed. $18,000 for an assessment that never happened. Brenda exhaled slowly. Multiply that by dozens of similar transactions. He's moved close to $500,000 over the years. The number made the air feel thin. My father had always prided himself on discipline, clean lines, polished shoes, immaculate conduct. And yet beneath all that, he'd been quietly building an empire out of deceit. I stared at the screen and whispered, "He built this in Mom's name." "I'm sorry," Brenda said. "I know what that means to you. It means everything I believed about him was a lie." For a long moment, we both sat in silence, the glow of the monitor casting our faces in pale blue light. Then I asked, "What happens if I report this?" "It depends who you report it to," she said carefully. "CID will investigate, but it'll get messy. They'll dig into everyone he's ever worked with, including you. If he manipulated your assignments, they'll question your promotions too. So even if I do the right thing, I lose." "Not necessarily," Brenda said. "If you can prove intent, if you can show you didn't benefit directly, you might be fine. But it'll be public. Every headline will have your last name." I thought about that. My name, our name attached to disgrace. He always said legacy was everything, I murmured. Maybe this is what legacy really looks like. Brenda looked at me with quiet sympathy. "You could walk away. Let CID find it themselves. No one would know you had anything to do with it." "And live with knowing I stayed silent," I asked. "That's not who I am anymore." She nodded, once understanding. "Then we do this right. Gather proof, chain of custody, verified sources. The evidence has to be airtight before you send it anywhere." I nodded. "We'll build a case." The next morning, while the base moved in its usual rhythm, cadets running drills, radios buzzing with call signs, I sat in my office reviewing the files again, this time through the lens of strategy. Each transaction told a story. A contractor paid above market rate. A donation deposited days after a contract extension. It wasn't sloppy corruption. It was deliberate, systematic, calculated to look like coincidence. My father hadn't just manipulated people, he'd engineered trust. Around noon, I received a message from an old contact in finance I'd discreetly reached out to. You're right, the Hartman Foundation was flagged once in 2020 for irregular patterns, but the report vanished before follow-up. Internal request override. The override signature belonged to one of his former subordinates, a man who owed his career to my father. The net of complicity stretched wider than I'd imagined. I printed the confirmation and added it to the folder. There was no turning back now. Late that night, I sat alone in my apartment. The snow outside reflected the dim yellow glow from the streetlight, making everything look frozen in time. I poured a cup of coffee I didn't touch and stared at the wall where a photo of my parents hung. They were younger, laughing, his arm around her shoulder, her eyes full of light. It was the image of a family that never really existed. You used her, I whispered. You used her to wash your sins clean. I felt the tremor of heartbreak, deep, quiet, inevitable. Then it passed, leaving behind only resolve. I turned back to my laptop and began recording a private log, a simple voice memo. Date, February 8th, 2024. Evidence confirms misuse of military funds through a private foundation tied to Colonel Raymond Hartman. I am documenting this for record. Action pending. My voice didn't shake. It sounded like command. When I finished, I saved it under a new folder, Operation Ghost Ledger. Then I wrote a single note beneath it, a reminder to myself of what Avery had told me. Don't fight angry, fight smart. The line steadied me. I closed the laptop, extinguished the light, and stood at the window watching Fort Hood in the distance, that vast, disciplined world still marching to the illusion of order. Beneath it, truth was gathering weight, and I was done pretending not to see it. The next phase wouldn't be about discovery anymore. It would be about action. The morning I decided to act, the sky over Fort Hood was gray and low, the kind of sky that pressed down on everything like a warning. I had spent the night reviewing the files again and again until exhaustion blurred the numbers, but my conviction stayed sharp. I called Avery just after dawn, my voice steady despite the weight of what I was about to say. I have proof, I told him. He didn't ask what kind. He just said, then it's time we meet. We chose a quiet diner 20 miles outside Killeen, the same one where we'd met weeks before. When I arrived, Avery was already there, his hands clasped around a coffee mug, eyes fixed on the window. Brenda joined us a few minutes later, sliding into the booth beside me. Her tone was all business. Everything's copied and verified, she said. Paper trail, digital backups, multiple timestamps. We've got enough to trigger an inquiry. I pulled a flash drive from my pocket, small and silver, containing the kind of truth that could end a career or several. Avery looked at it for a long moment before speaking. You understand what happens when this goes forward, he said. It won't just take down your father. It'll shake a whole branch of the network he built. People will fight to keep it buried. I know, I said, but if I do nothing, I'm part of it. He nodded, satisfied. Then, here's what we'll do. You send this to CID anonymously. They'll need time to verify, and that's when you stay silent. Keep working, keep showing up, act like everything's normal. And if he figures it out? Brenda asked. Avery leaned back, his gaze distant. Then it'll be too late for him to control the narrative. We spent the next 2 hours outlining the plan in detail, how to format the evidence package, which channels to use, how to protect metadata. Brenda would handle the logistics of sending it through an encrypted drop. Avery would act as the external verifier, confirming authenticity through his retired officer contacts. I would do the hardest part, nothing. Pretend ignorance. Keep my composure around the man who had betrayed both his oath and his family. When the meeting ended, Avery looked at me with something almost paternal in his eyes. Elise, he said quietly. You're doing what most people can't, choosing principle over blood. That's not cruelty. That's courage. I wanted to believe him, but part of me still trembled. It doesn't feel like courage, I said. It feels like loss. It's both, he said. Every righteous act costs something. That night, I sat at my kitchen table again, watching the cursor blink on my laptop screen. I wrote the report in precise military language. Dates, accounts, links, attachments. No emotion, no accusation, just evidence. When I was done, I read it 3 times, removed every trace of personal involvement, and saved it under a neutral title, Training Fund Audit Review. At exactly midnight, I sent it through an anonymous upload portal directly to the CID's data intake server. The moment I clicked send, my hands went still. It was done. Somewhere, a chain of command would wake up to the truth, and an investigation would begin without my name attached. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling neither relief nor fear, just stillness. Over the next weeks, I lived 2 parallel lives. By day, I was Major Hartman, efficient and calm, coordinating logistics and attending briefings as if nothing had changed. By night, I tracked the progress, quietly watching for any ripple in his behavior. The first came mid-December, when my father called unexpectedly. His voice was cautious, almost rehearsed. "Elise," he said, "we should have dinner. It's Christmas. It's been too long." I hesitated, sensing layers behind the words. "All right," I said. "Your place?" "Yes," he replied. "Just us." When the day arrived, I drove to his house in Temple, Texas, a place that had once felt like home, but now seemed curated, every photo and medal displayed to maintain the illusion of honor. He greeted me at the door with the same stern composure he wore at military ceremonies. For a moment, I saw the father who'd once saluted me at my first command, and my heart ached despite everything. The dinner table was set with precision roast beef, vegetables, red wine. We ate mostly in silence. Then he spoke, his tone clipped. "I've heard whispers at the base," he said. "Something about an audit. Old records. People asking questions." I kept my eyes on my plate. "Audits happen all the time," I said lightly. "Part of maintaining accountability." "Accountability?" He repeated, his eyes narrowing. "You sound just like your mother." I didn't respond. He leaned back, the faintest smirk on his lips. "Are you proud now, Major? You think taking my name down will lift yours?" I looked at him, then really looked. The man across from me wasn't the commanding officer I'd once admired. He was a relic of power too long unchallenged. "Not yet," I said evenly. His smirk faltered, replaced by confusion, then unease. I finished my meal, stood, and placed my napkin neatly on the table. "Thank you for dinner, Colonel," I said. He flinched at the title, formal, distant, intentional. "Merry Christmas." As I walked out into the cold night, the air burned against my lungs, sharp and freeing. I didn't look back. He'd taught me to fight with precision, and now he'd learn what that meant. After I left his house that night, the investigation I had set in motion began to move through channels I could not see, quiet and deliberate. The anonymous package to CID arrived in their secured intake the next week, acknowledged by an automated receipt that Brenda forwarded to my burner address with a single line, "Received." No timelines, no promises, just the small confirmation that paperwork had a way of starting things. From that point on, the plan was patience. Avery reminded me over a terse phone call that the Army moved slowly when it meant to be thorough, and that slowness would be our ally if we did not rush it. He told me to maintain my routine, to keep my office hours full, to be visible but not dramatic. "Let them see you functioning," he said. "A competent officer undermines gossip better than words." I followed his counsel like an order. I signed requisitions, reviewed shipment manifests, attended staff meetings, and offered steady answers when junior officers asked for guidance. When the inspector for routine compliance walked the yard, I briefed him with crisp clarity, the sort of performance meant to reassure a chain of command. None of it felt like acting. It felt like reclaiming the parts of my life that belonged to me and not to the shadow of his name. Still beneath the surface, the current pulled at everything. Periodically, Brenda would slip a note or a flash drive into my locker, updated vendor lists, a scanned memo that matched a suspicious transfer, a photo of a receipt with a signature that matched my father's handwriting. Each item was cataloged, time-stamped, and duplicated in 3 secure locations. Avery called occasionally to confirm nuance or to warn of personnel who might be compromised. He had sources, retired people who still cared for the integrity of the service, who would quietly test narratives and report back how rumors spread among the retired colonel's social circles. Those reports were invaluable. They told us who could be swayed, who was likely to defend my father without evidence, and who would remain objective. As the weeks passed, small ripples became larger waves. An internal compliance officer contacted my office under the pretense of routine paperwork questions and asked about procurement reviews I had overseen. I answered with fact states and explanations, providing documents that showed chain of custody for key contracts. I did not volunteer the Hartman files. I let the inbound questions shape the disclosure so it appeared procedural and not reactive. That was deliberate. The less I seemed led by emotion, the more credible the record I would leave. My father, sensing pressure though not knowing its source, began to change his behavior in small telling ways. He started attending more public events, shaking more hands, polishing speeches into absolutes about honor and stewardship. He sent a newsletter through his social circle, reminding everyone of service and sacrifice, the language of a man trying to remind others why they once believed him without question. Privately, he called a few of his old friends asking for support and suggesting that there were people undermining the base from inside. Those calls were boomerangs that Brenda and I quietly traced back to a couple of sympathetic officers who then began posting thinly veiled defenses online. We expected that. Manipulation of public sentiment was part of his playbook. What surprised me was a subtle escalation, an anonymous complaint filed through official channels alleging a procedural oversight in one of my unit's end-of-year requisitions. It was framed as concern for fiscal responsibility and came with scanned attachments that implied hurried approvals on my part. I forwarded the complaint to Avery in a locked message and included a list of times, names, and signatures that proved the approvals had followed protocol. He replied in one line, "Good. Keep the trail clean." The complaint led to a formal low-level audit that required me to provide additional documentation. I complied, supplying the same records I had already prepared, each stamped and dated, each placed under the protective chain of custody Brenda had taught me to maintain. At night, I rehearsed answers in my head, as if for a hearing precise and unemotional. The more they pried, the clearer the pattern of my father's interference became. The more I complied, the less room his narrative had to breathe. Meanwhile, he tried another tack. A well-placed op-ed in a regional military newsletter praised his decades of service and accused unnamed critics of undermining tradition. Pictures accompanied the article, him at ceremonies, him with veterans smiling in frames that suggested a life of unblemished honor. The timing coincided with a CID administrative check that required base public affairs to issue a standard message about confidentiality and due process. Public affairs did so in neutral language, but the effect was obvious, a buffer that slowed down gossip and gave perceived legitimacy back to the old guard. That buffer bought us time. Avery used that time to contact a retired CID investigator he trusted and ask about procedural thresholds, what level of evidence triggered subpoenas, how quickly forensic accounting could validate or refute routing anomalies, and how to ensure chain of custody could withstand legal scrutiny. We learned the lines to respect. Do not touch original documents unnecessarily. Do not send unencrypted files through personal accounts, and maintain direct timestamps for every interaction. We learned how to position evidence so that when CID stepped in, they would see a trail that led cleanly from vendor to shell company to foundation to the people who benefited. The strategy felt clinical and cold at times, but I reminded myself that it was the opposite of cruelty. It was an attempt to align truth with consequence. On Christmas Eve, I attended a small memorial at the base chapel where names of the fallen were read aloud. My father was there in his polished coat, a tight smile on his face. We exchanged a few words about tradition, about service. It felt ordinary in the way that duty does numb and necessary. He invited me to dinner the next day. I accepted because pretending normalcy was part of the plan. At the table, he watched me with an intensity that was almost tender, as if waiting for me to crack to respond with raw emotion that he could then analyze and weaponize. Instead, I listened, answered politely, and let the conversation pass like weather. When he finally asked, eyes searching beneath the lamplight, "Are you proud now?" "Major." I allowed a calm smile. "Not yet," I said. The words were brief, but they contained a promise that required no volume to be heard. Outside, the night was cold, and somewhere in the bureaucracy, a file was being opened that would not close easily. March 2024 arrived cold and bright, the kind of spring that promised warmth but still carried winter in its bones. The Veterans Honors Gala was the event of the season at Fort Hood, an annual celebration of service, legacy, and sacrifice. The base had been buzzing about it for weeks. Every officer, retiree, and dignitary within 100 miles wanted a seat at that banquet hall. This year's theme was Integrity Through Generations, a title that made me smile bitterly every time I saw it printed on the invitation. I hadn't planned to attend. But then an email came directly from command, formal, polite, and impossible to ignore. Major Elise Hartman, you have been selected to deliver the keynote address recognizing the next generation of officers. The irony wasn't lost on me. Brenda had forwarded it to me with one line. Fate's sense of humor is impeccable. Avery's response was simpler. Say yes. The timing's perfect. I did. For weeks leading up to the event, the CID investigation moved quietly through layers of procedure. There were no public statements yet, no visible signs of the storm beneath the surface. But I knew the fuse had already been lit. My father, oblivious, had been invited as an honored guest, one of the senior veterans whose name still carried weight across Texas. He accepted immediately. I saw the RSVP list and felt my pulse slow in anticipation. He would be there. So would I. And for the first time, our definitions of honor would share the same stage. The night of the gala arrived under a pale moon, the air crisp as glass. The banquet hall shimmered with gold lighting and patriotic banners, the kind of setting meant to inspire reverence. Chandeliers glittered above polished marble floors, and waiters in white gloves floated between tables carrying champagne and small plates. A military band played softly near the stage. I arrived in my dress uniform, black, pressed, immaculate, every medal and ribbon exactly where it belonged. My hair was pulled tight into regulation perfection, my expression unreadable. Cameras flashed, voices mingled, laughter spilled over the music. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with the faint polish of brass. Across the room I spotted him immediately, Colonel Rhett. Raymond Hartman standing in the center of a small crowd, his posture still commanding, his silver hair shining under the lights. He looked untouchable, just as he always had. People clapped him on the back, called him sir, and smiled like he was a monument. For a brief second he caught sight of me across the hall. His expression barely shifted, but I caught the faint curl of a smirk, the silent message of a man convinced of his untouchable place. I nodded once in acknowledgement, neutral and distant, then turned away. Brenda was seated near the press table, disguised as part of the logistics staff. Avery wasn't there. He'd said it was best if he watched from a distance. Let them have their theater, he'd told me. You just deliver the truth. As dinner concluded, the MC's voice carried through the hall. Tonight, we are honored to introduce Major Elise Hartman, whose distinguished service in logistics and training has exemplified integrity and resilience. Please welcome her to the stage. Applause followed, polite but warm. I rose, adjusted my jacket, and walked toward the podium. The spotlight hit me bright and cold. My heart beat evenly, not from nerves, but from focus. Behind me, a massive LED screen projected the gala logo and the American flag waving in slow motion. I began speaking about leadership, about mentorship, about the lessons the military teaches in silence and sacrifice. My tone was measured calm, each word deliberate. I spoke about legacy, about the weight of names, about the danger of confusing fear with respect. The audience listened. My father's face in the crowd remained unreadable, though his hands were clasped too tightly around his glass. I reached the final part of my speech, the section I'd written last after a long conversation with Avery. I looked down at the paper, then back up. Integrity, I said, isn't inherited. It's chosen. Every day by every soldier in every act that no one sees. Just then, a flicker crossed the LED screen behind me. The flag dissolved, replaced by a live feed. The sound in the room changed the low hum of curiosity, the scrape of chairs as people turned toward the screen. I stepped back, slightly not surprised. The feed came from a press conference being held at that very moment by the Army Criminal Investigation Division. The CID insignia filled the screen, followed by a uniformed spokesperson. This morning, he said, his voice amplified through the hall speakers, the Criminal Investigation Division initiated formal proceedings regarding misappropriation of training funds connected to the Hartman Foundation. Preliminary findings link retired Colonel Raymond Hartman to unauthorized transactions involving federal contracts. An arrest warrant has been issued pending confirmation of evidence. The words landed like artillery. Gasps rippled across the room. Conversations erupted in low, stunned murmurs. The band stopped mid-note. I didn't move. My father's face turned white, his mouth opening slightly before he caught himself. His glass slipped from his hand and shattered against the floor, a sharp sound that cut through the murmurs like a signal. Cameras swung toward him. The spotlight shifted, catching him in its glow. For the first time in my life, he looked small. Not because he'd been exposed, but because he finally had nothing left to hide behind. I turned toward him, meeting his eyes across the hall. The air between us was electric and still. I spoke into the microphone, my voice steady and low. "Everyone I said will get what they deserve, Colonel." The silence that followed was complete. Then, slowly, CID officers entered the hall through the side doors, their badges glinting under the lights. The MC tried to regain control, stammering into his mic, but the night had already shifted beyond ceremony. My father didn't resist when they approached him. He straightened his jacket, squared his shoulders out of habit, and let them escort him away as flashbulbs exploded like gunfire. He didn't look back at me. He didn't have to. I already knew what that look would say. It would say, "You won." It would mean you ended me. But what I felt wasn't triumph. It was the kind of justice that doesn't cheer, it exhales. The kind that costs more than it gives. The kind that changes you. For a long moment after he was escorted out, the entire hall seemed frozen in disbelief. The silence had weight like a held breath before a storm. I could hear the faint echo of the officer's footsteps fading down the corridor, the shuffle of pressed uniforms and polished shoes, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The MC whispered something off mic, but no one was listening anymore. All attention remained on the podium, on me, the daughter of the man whose name had just turned into an indictment. My throat felt dry, but my mind was calm. The instinctive soldier's training took over stand tall control. The space finished the mission. I looked around the room, meeting eyes that darted between sympathy, suspicion, and awe. Some saw a whistleblower, others saw a traitor. All I could think was that for the first time, the truth was no longer my burden alone. I leaned toward the microphone, my voice soft but clear. "The Army taught me that integrity means doing the right thing even when no one is watching," I said. "Tonight, everyone is watching." A hush followed. Then one person started clapping a slow, steady rhythm that spread hesitant at first, then stronger. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was respectful, deliberate, the sound of people acknowledging something that cost more than it appeared. I nodded once, stepped back from the podium, and walked off stage as the applause carried on, echoing like distant thunder. Brenda was waiting near the side entrance, her face pale but eyes bright with disbelief. "You planned for an announcement," she whispered, "but not that." I shook my head. Neither did I. CID must have moved faster than we thought. "They couldn't have timed it better," she said quietly. "It couldn't have been scripted." "It wasn't," I said. "That's what makes it real." We left the hall through a side exit, avoiding the swirl of reporters already crowding the lobby. Outside, the March wind was sharp, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the wail of a siren somewhere beyond the base perimeter. The moon hung low, and the stars above Texas were faint behind thin clouds. I paused under the portico, breathing in the night air that smelled faintly of rain and jet fuel. For the first time in months, my shoulders felt lighter. Not free, but lighter. Brenda touched my arm. "You did what had to be done," she said. "He gave you no choice." "There's always a choice," I murmured. I just stopped choosing silence. We stood there for a while, neither speaking, both knowing that the real consequences would come later, the interviews, the headlines, the scrutiny. But that night, the truth had spoken loud enough for all of them. The following morning, news spread faster than wildfire. Retired Colonel Raymond Hartman under investigation for corruption and fraud. Every outlet had a variation of the same headline. Television anchors used words like shock, betrayal, disgrace. Old colleagues of his gave vague statements about surprise and disappointment. Online opinions split along familiar lines. Some hailed it as courage, others as family betrayal. I didn't read most of it. Brenda filtered what mattered. What caught my attention wasn't the coverage itself, but one detail buried in a local report. CID had confirmed that the investigation had begun after receiving credible documentation from an anonymous source within the Army. They didn't name me, but the phrasing was deliberate. It established that the evidence had come from inside, from someone who knew exactly where to look. My father must have read that line because 2 days later I received a letter postmarked from the county detention facility where he'd been temporarily held. It wasn't long, just a folded page written in his precise, controlled handwriting. "You've humiliated this family. You've destroyed my name. You think this is justice, but it's vengeance. I hope you can live with it." I read it twice, then set it on fire over the kitchen sink. The ash curled into gray petals and vanished down the drain. "I can," I whispered. The next week was a blur of administrative statements and quiet debriefs. I was summoned by CID not as a suspect, but as a witness. They asked procedural questions, how I'd noticed irregularities when I'd begun documenting why I hadn't come forward sooner. I answered each question calmly, clearly, without emotion. Facts were armor. Emotion was liability. When it was over, the lead investigator shook my hand. "You did the right thing, Major," he said. "You helped us protect the system." I nodded. That's what we're supposed to do. Still, when I walked out of the CID building that afternoon, I couldn't shake the hollow ache inside. Justice had a strange sound. It wasn't the crash of downfall, but the quiet closing of doors that would never open again. A week later, Command sent me an invitation to another event, a smaller ceremony recognizing officers who had demonstrated exceptional adherence to ethical leadership. I almost laughed at the irony, but accepted anyway. The event took place in the same hall where the gala had imploded, though it felt entirely different now. No chandeliers, no champagne, just folded flags and muted conversation. When they called my name to the stage, I walked up, accepted the plaque, and looked out at the small crowd. Most of them avoided my eyes, unsure whether to admire or fear what I had done. I simply said, "Integrity is heavier than rank," then stepped down. Brenda caught me at the exit, grinning softly. "That line will follow you forever," she said. "Let it," I replied. That night, alone at home, I poured a cup of coffee and sat by the window, overlooking the quiet lights of Killeen. My reflection in the glass looked older, sharper. Not broken, just changed. Outside, Fort Hood gleamed under the steady rhythm of training lights, soldiers still running drills, the flag still flying high. The institution endured as it always did, but somewhere within its walls a silent shift had happened. Legacy no longer belonged to him. It belonged to truth. Before turning in, I opened my laptop and wrote the final line in my private journal, the same one that had started with Operation Ghost Ledger. He taught me to fight with precision. I used it to end his war. I saved it, closed the lid, and whispered the question that would one day anchor the video's ending. Would you have done it? Exposed your own blood for the truth? By April, the headlines had gone from scandal to sentence. Retired colonel under investigation for misappropriation of federal funds had evolved into CID confirms financial crimes linked to Hartman Foundation. Each iteration stripped another layer off his myth. The man who had once been quoted in military journals about honor and leadership was now a name associated with corruption, embezzlement, and betrayal. Every morning I saw his face on the local broadcasts, that same photograph from years ago, clean-cut, decorated, confident, now framed by phrases like alleged misconduct and pending indictment. I didn't watch for long. The sound of his voice on archived interviews made my stomach turn. But still, I couldn't look away entirely. After all I had set this in motion, Brenda brought me the official CID summary one morning, sliding it across my desk without a word. The report was thick-bound and stamped classified, internal use only. She pointed to one section near the end. Read that. It said the investigation had uncovered over $600,000 in unaccounted transfers connected to shell vendors and personal accounts. The language was sterile, procedural, bloodless, but I knew what it meant. Years of deceit condensed into a paragraph of consequences. "They froze his accounts last week," Brenda said quietly. "The house and temple, too. It's under asset review." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "And the pension suspended pending trial." She hesitated, then added, "They revoked his guest access at Fort Hood. He's been blacklisted from base events." The irony hit like a dull blade. The man who had once been the face of the officer corps could no longer step foot on the ground he once ruled. I closed the file and set it aside. "He'll call," Brenda said. "You know he will." "I won't answer," I said. The call came that evening. The phone buzzed on my nightstand for almost a full minute, his name flashing across the screen. "Dad." I watched it ring until it stopped. Then it rang again. I let it. The silence that followed was louder than the sound itself. The next day, a courier arrived at my office with a small envelope, no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately: sharp, deliberate military script. Inside was a single piece of lined paper. The words were few, but each one carried weight. "You destroyed me." I read it 3 times, each time slower, the letters blurring slightly at the edges. For years, those words had been his weapon, every guilt trip, every accusation, every manipulation wrapped in the same tone: "You owe me. You failed me. You embarrassed me." Now, for the first time, they meant nothing. I folded the paper neatly, slid it into a blank envelope, and sent it back to his address with nothing inside. Just emptiness. Silence returned in kind. A day later, Brenda called. "You really sent it blank?" "Yes." "That's brutal." "No," I said softly. "It's honest." The fallout spread faster than anyone predicted. Former allies began distancing themselves. The military associations removed his name from plaques and donation boards. His longtime speaking engagements were canceled. The public persona he'd built over decades crumbled with the efficiency of a controlled demolition. At Fort Hood, whispers shifted from pity to practicality. His reputation had been currency, and now that it was worthless, people spent their loyalty elsewhere. "They're all pretending they never knew him," Brenda said one afternoon, scrolling through a social feed filled with deleted posts. "Funny how fast honor evaporates." "It always does when it costs too much," I replied. But even as his empire collapsed, there was no satisfaction in watching it fall. I thought there would be. I thought I'd feel the vindication of justice, the sweet pulse of revenge completed. Instead, what settled over me was quiet. Not peace, not regret, just quiet. Late one night, unable to sleep, I drove to Temple. The town was small, the streets familiar. His house sat dark at the end of the cul-de-sac, the windows boarded on one side, a foreclosure notice taped to the door. The lawn, once perfectly trimmed, was overgrown. I parked across the street and turned off the engine. For a long time, I just sat there, watching the faint movement of curtains inside. I wondered if he was still there, awake like me, replaying every decision, every word. Maybe he was writing another letter. Maybe he was too proud to. The porch light flickered on, suddenly flooding the yard with yellow. I saw him then, thinner, slower, his shoulders rounded. He stepped onto the porch, looked around like he could sense someone watching, and then sat down heavily on the steps. Even from a distance, I could tell he looked smaller than I remembered. The man who once towered over every room now seemed consumed by it. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't speak. I just watched until the light flicked off again. As I drove away, a line Avery once said echoed in my head. "Every righteous act costs something." Now I understood what that meant. Justice wasn't triumph. It was the quiet subtraction of illusion. It was standing in the ruins of what you'd built to protect yourself and realizing you'd only built walls. Back home, I stood at the window overlooking Colleen's dim city lights. The air smelled of rain again like it had before the gala. I whispered to the glass, not sure who I was speaking to anymore. "You destroyed yourself." Weeks passed and the story didn't fade. Every newspaper from Austin to Dallas carried updates, each headline another nail sealing the coffin of his reputation. Local news ran a segment showing archived footage of him giving a speech on ethics and leadership, his words spliced ironically against the charges scrolling underneath. I didn't watch all of it, but Brenda sent me a clip with a short message. "You don't need to feel guilty for his choices." I told her I didn't, but that wasn't entirely true. Guilt had a strange way of lingering even when logic said it shouldn't. He'd taught me everything about order and honor, but never about grace. I spent those days walking the fine line between relief and grief, the two emotions overlapping until I couldn't tell one from the other. The Army issued a public statement acknowledging his cooperation with investigators. The tone was careful, almost apologetic, as if trying to preserve the dignity of the institution even as it condemned the man. Avery called a few days later. His voice carried that steady calm that had guided me through every turning point of this storm. "It's over," he said. "CID will finalize the charges this month. They're recommending restitution and a suspended sentence because of his age." "So he won't serve time," I said. "No," Avery replied, "but his legacy will." I stayed quiet for a moment. That's the part that hurts him most. "Then justice has already been served," he said. The next week, a package arrived at my apartment. No return address this time, just my name printed in careful, familiar handwriting. Inside was a small box and a folded note. I hesitated before opening it. The note was short, written in ink that had bled slightly on the paper. "You think I'm broken, but I built everything you stand on. When the world forgets me, remember that." Beneath it was his old officer's insignia, the same one he'd pinned to my uniform when I graduated from West Point. I held it for a long moment, the metal cold against my skin. Then I set it down and walked to the fireplace. The flames caught quickly, swallowing paper and pride alike. I didn't watch it burn. I didn't need to. The next morning, Brenda found me in the office early, reviewing logistics schedules like nothing had changed. "You're really back to normal?" she asked. "Normal's overrated," I said. "I'm back to purpose." "You could take leave," she offered. "No one would blame you. No one ever blamed him either," I replied. She nodded, understanding what I meant. That afternoon, Command released the official findings: fraud confirmed, pension revoked, public dishonor recommended. His medals and commendations were subject to review, and his foundation was dissolved under federal order. The statement ended with the usual phrase: "The Army remains committed to integrity and accountability at all levels." It was bureaucratic closure, nothing more. Yet reading it, I felt something unclench in my chest. For years, his name had been my shadow. Now it was just text on paper, finite, contained. Still, the silence that followed was heavier than expected. The calls stopped, the interviews ended, the attention faded. What remained was quiet, too quiet, like the pause between lightning and thunder. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself driving again, this time not to Temple, but toward the old training fields beyond Fort Hood. The sky was moonless, the air thick with the scent of dust and pine. I parked near the fence line and stood there looking out over the empty grounds where I had once learned to march, to fight, to endure. That's where he'd taught me discipline, shouting commands that drilled themselves into muscle and bone. Now those echoes were mine alone. I whispered into the wind, "You taught me to be like you. You just never thought I'd use it against you." My voice sounded strange in the open air, swallowed quickly by the night. When I returned home, an envelope was waiting at my door. The handwriting was different this time, smaller, shakier. Inside, a single page. "They're taking everything. The house, the car. I have nothing left. If you have any mercy left for me, send help." I read it once, folded it, and placed it in my desk drawer beside the blank letter I'd sent weeks earlier. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. He'd used mercy as leverage his whole life, and now that it no longer worked, he was finally meeting the silence he had earned. The following week, I saw the notice in the paper: Hartman Residence auctioned, Temple TX. Former property of Colonel Raymond Hartman. No mention of the man himself, just the property, as if history had reduced him to an address. I tore the clipping out and tucked it into my journal, not as a trophy, but as evidence that closure sometimes looks like absence. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild routines. I took long runs at dawn, returned to mentoring young officers, and started sleeping without waking from the same recurring dream of confrontation and consequence. But occasionally, in the stillness before morning, I'd hear his voice echo in memory, sharp, commanding, unstoppable, and I'd answer it silently. "You destroyed yourself." I never said it with hate, only truth, because in the end, he hadn't fallen because of me. He had fallen because he believed he never could. And that was the most tragic part of all. It was late July when the first message came, 3 months after the headlines had gone quiet. My inbox was empty except for an email that looked out of place, its subject line written in the clipped tone of a man who still thought authority came with punctuation. "They're freezing my pension. Help me, Elise." The sender address was an old personal one, not his official account. For a few seconds, I just stared at it, unsure whether to open it or delete it. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, caught between instinct and exhaustion. Against my better judgment, I clicked. The message was short, like all his commands used to be. "They're taking everything. I can't access my pension, and the bills are piling up. I've spoken to legal aid, but they say it could take months. You're good with systems. You can fix this. You always could." No apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Just expectation wrapped in desperation and disguised as logic. I read it twice, the words tightening something in my chest that I had thought long healed. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't even ask for help. He demanded it as if nothing had changed. For a moment, I considered replying with the same emptiness I'd sent before, a blank email silence as punctuation, but something in the phrasing stopped me. There was weakness there, not manipulation. The old certainty had drained out of his tone, leaving behind something frail. Brenda noticed my distraction that morning at the office. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. "Not a ghost," I replied. "Just someone who doesn't know he's already gone." He reached out. "Yes." "What did he say?" "Exactly what he's always said. Fix it." She shook her head. "Are you going to—" "No," I said automatically. But the truth was less simple. That night I couldn't sleep. The email sat in my mind like a ticking clock. I tried to ignore it, but curiosity and something deeper, something that still resembled obligation, kept me awake. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. Not to help, but to look. I opened the Army Health Network database using my clearance and searched for Raymond Hartman. The results showed a recent hospital admission, Temple Military Medical Center, Ward C Cardiology Unit. My throat tightened. He wasn't just broke, he was sick. The next day, I drove to Temple. The roads were long and empty, the summer air shimmering off the asphalt. As I approached the medical campus, the weight of memory pressed against me. This was the same facility where my mother had been treated before she died. I parked and sat there for a long time, staring at the hospital entrance, wondering what I was hoping to find. Closure. Pity, revenge. None of it felt right. Inside, the corridor smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. The receptionist gave me a polite nod when I asked for his room. "Family," she asked. "Daughter." I said the word, tasting strange. Room 214 was quiet, except for the low beeping of monitors. He was sitting up in bed, thinner than I remembered, his skin pale and waxy. For a moment, he didn't notice me. His eyes were fixed on the window where sunlight filtered through the blinds in narrow gold lines. When he finally turned his head, his face flickered with something that wasn't surprise, just the dull recognition of inevitability. "Elise," he said softly, his voice cracked and dry. "You came." "I read your email," I said. "You said you needed help. They're freezing my accounts." He said, his breath uneven. "The lawyers are useless. They say it'll take months." "I don't have months." His tone shifted, the old command still buried under fatigue. "You can talk to someone. You can fix this. You think I still have that kind of power I asked?" "You always had it," he said. "You just used it against me." The words hung there between us, sharp and hollow. I moved closer, stopping at the edge of the bed. "You did this to yourself," I said quietly. "All of it. You think I meant for this," he said, his voice trembling now. "I did it for your mother. I kept the foundation alive in her name. I made sure people remembered her. By laundering money through it," I said, my tone cold. "By turning her name into a smokescreen." His eyes filled with tears, though whether from guilt or illness, I couldn't tell. "I did it for her," he repeated, weaker this time, as if convincing himself. I looked at him for a long moment, the same man who once told me that soldiers don't cry. Now he couldn't stop. I felt nothing. "Mom would have been ashamed," I said finally. His face crumpled, the last of his strength draining out through his eyes. He looked at me, then really looked the way people do when they realize there's no more ground left beneath them. His lips trembled as if to form a reply, but nothing came. The silence between us stretched long and suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant shuffle of nurses in the corridor. His chest rose and fell unevenly, the faint hiss of oxygen the only rhythm left to him. When he finally spoke, his voice was little more than a whisper. "You were always like her," he said, too proud to bend. I stared at the wall behind him where a framed military certificate hung slightly crooked. "Maybe," I said, "but at least she didn't break others to prove her strength." He winced like I'd struck him. "You think this was easy," he rasped. "You think I wanted any of this? I spent my life serving, building, keeping everything together, and what do I have left?" "Nothing," I said softly, "because you built it all on fear." His hand trembled as he reached for the glass of water on the table, but he couldn't hold it steady. I hesitated only a second before stepping forward to steady it, our fingers brushing for the first time in years. His skin was cold and papery, the veins visible beneath the surface. He took a small sip, then set it down, his breath shallow. "I thought I was protecting us," he said after a moment. "Your mother. You the family name. You don't understand what it means to have it all depend on you." "I understand exactly," I said. "You just forgot that protecting people and controlling them aren't the same thing." He turned away, his gaze unfocused on the window. "You think you're better than me now?" he said bitterly. "You think righteousness makes you clean?" "No," I replied, "but it keeps me from becoming you." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The monitor beeped steadily beside him, counting down moments I didn't want but couldn't avoid. He looked smaller with each breath, as if deflating under the weight of everything he'd refused to face. "You came all this way," he said finally, his tone almost pleading. "Doesn't that mean something?" "It means I needed to see for myself that you're still alive," I said. "And now that I have, I can leave knowing I did more than you ever did for me." His jaw tightened, and he looked at me with that same cold authority that used to silence entire rooms. But the power behind it was gone hollow. "You're no daughter of mine." He said the words, deliberate, cruel, designed to wound one last time. I met his gaze without flinching. "You made sure of that." I turned toward the door, hearing the faint hitch of his breath behind me. Maybe from pain, maybe from the impact of truth. I didn't look back. The hallway outside was bright, sterile, almost blinding after the dim room. As I walked, the air felt heavier with every step, the fluorescent lights humming above like a metronome, marking the end of something final. At the nurse's station, I paused, filling out a visitor's form with my name and the time. The nurse, a kind-looking woman with tired eyes, glanced at me. "He doesn't get many visitors," she said softly. "He told us he had a daughter once." I handed her the clipboard. "He did," I said. "She grew up." Outside, the Texas sun had already begun to sink, painting the parking lot in deep amber light. I sat in the car for a long time before starting, the engine hands resting on the wheel, mind strangely quiet. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, just the steady realization that closure wasn't something you found. It was something you chose. I looked back once at the hospital, the building glowing in the dusk. Somewhere in there, the man who had shaped and broken me was facing his own ending. Maybe he'd convince himself that he'd done it all for love. Maybe he'd believe his own story until the very last breath. But I no longer had to. The road stretched ahead long and open, the horizon tinted gold. I rolled down the window and let the hot wind fill the car, carrying away the remnants of a name that no longer defined me. Behind me, the past was ending in the slow rhythm of a dying heartbeat. Ahead, something quieter waited, not peace exactly, but space to begin again. I whispered to the empty air, a final message to the man who'd built an empire of control only to lose it to his own hands. "Rest, Colonel. You finally met the one battle you couldn't win." Then I drove away without looking back. The weeks that followed his final plea passed like slow-moving fog, dense but harmless. And for the first time in months, the air around me no longer carried the static of confrontation. The investigation was over. The public had moved on, and so had I, though in quieter, less visible ways. At Fort Hood, the rhythms of military life pulsed on as if nothing had happened. Marches, drills, briefings, paperwork, and yet everything felt different, sharper, more deliberate. I arrived early every morning, often before sunrise, when the field was still draped in soft gray light. My position had changed too. The official memo came in the second week of September. Major Elise Hartman is hereby promoted to Training Operations Director effective immediately. The words were dry procedural, but when I read them, I felt something settle inside me, not pride exactly, but balance. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone beyond Brenda and Colonel Avery. There was no champagne, no speech, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd reached a height my father had always believed I couldn't climb without his hand. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I walked through the corridors of headquarters, now people greeted me with a mixture of respect and hesitation. The whispers hadn't entirely faded, but they'd softened, transforming from gossip into quiet acknowledgement. They knew what I'd done, not just the exposure, but the restraint. I hadn't dragged his name through the mud. I'd simply refused to clean up his mess. That distinction mattered to me. Brenda stopped by my office one morning, dropping a fresh stack of personnel files on my desk. "You know they're calling you the Quiet Storm?" she said, smiling faintly. "Behind your back, I mean. In a good way." I looked up from my paperwork. "Because of him." "Because you didn't explode," she said. "You dismantled him." I let out a slow breath, half a laugh. "That's not what I set out to do." "Maybe not," she said, leaning against the door frame. "But it's what had to happen." She hesitated a moment. "Are you okay?" I paused, realizing that for the first time I didn't have to pretend. "Yeah," I said. "I actually am." When she left, I turned to the window. From my office, I could see the training ground stretching toward the horizon, the American flag snapping against a mild autumn wind. Its movement was steady, unbroken, dignified. I stood there for a while, watching the cadets marching in formation, their voices rising in cadence calls that echoed faintly across the open field. Discipline, purpose, integrity. Words my father had used often, though not always understood. I whispered them under my breath like a private vow. The emails came next, reporters fishing for quotes, bloggers asking for comment, even one from a documentary producer who wanted to interview the daughter who brought down the colonel. I deleted them all without answering. I'd learned the power of silence, how sometimes the absence of a statement spoke louder than any declaration. At night, I'd drive home through the quiet streets of Killeen, past the diner where the younger officers liked to gather, past the church where my mother's memorial plaque still hung. Sometimes I'd park there for a few minutes, engine off, headlights dimmed, and just sit in the stillness. I didn't pray. I just listened to the night, to the soft murmur of life continuing indifferent and infinite. The guilt that used to press against my ribs was gone. Not replaced by triumph, but by something steadier, acceptance. I'd fought the war my father started, but I hadn't inherited his hunger for dominance. My victory wasn't loud. It was measured, earned in silence, lived in discipline. The kind of justice that didn't shout, the kind that endured. By October, the world had found new scandals, new distractions, and the Hartman name slipped quietly from headlines into archives. At Fort Hood, my days blended into a rhythm of purpose briefings, evaluations, field inspections, and mentoring younger officers who reminded me of who I had been 10 years earlier, ambitious, untested, still believing that respect was something granted rather than earned. I taught them differently. Leadership isn't about control, I told them one afternoon as we reviewed a failed logistics drill. It's about accountability. You don't demand trust, you build it. A few nodded some scribbled notes. I could see my younger self in their eyes, hungry for approval, desperate to prove something. I hoped they'd learn faster than I did that pride without empathy is just a uniform that doesn't fit. That evening, Colonel Avery stopped by my office, the man who had seen my rise and fall and rise again. He carried 2 cups of coffee, his version of a medal ceremony. "You're handling this transition well," he said. "I'm proud of you." I smiled faintly. "You trained me for it." "No," he said. "Life did. I just gave you the field manual." He glanced at the window where dusk had turned the flag outside into a silhouette. "You know," he added, "he would have hated this." "The quiet I asked. The justice Avery said. The kind that doesn't need a parade." His words lingered long after he left. Justice wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It was about equilibrium, putting things back where they belonged. And now finally everything was. The Army didn't mention him anymore. His records were sealed, his accolades reassigned, his foundation permanently dissolved. The Hartman name no longer carried weight, but for the first time that felt right. I wasn't living under it. I was living beyond it. One weekend, Brenda and I attended a cadet graduation ceremony. The air was bright with Texas sun, the kind that bleaches everything into clarity. When the new officers tossed their caps into the air, the sound was pure and untainted. I clapped with them, smiling, though my chest ached with a strange mix of nostalgia and peace. After the ceremony, a young lieutenant approached me. "Ma'am," she said, nervous but sincere, "I just wanted to say your training lectures helped me a lot. You said something about discipline being a choice, not a chain. I've been thinking about that every day." I looked at her and saw something unbroken, someone who might walk a path free of inherited damage. "Keep that line close," I said. "It'll save you someday." That night, I returned home to find a letter in my mailbox. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. My father's script fainter now, uneven. My pulse quickened as I opened it, half expecting another demand, another attempt to rewrite history. But there was only one line. "I hope you found peace, even if it wasn't with me." No signature, just the weight of something almost human. I folded the letter once and slipped it into my desk drawer beside a photograph of my mother in uniform, smiling the way he never did. I didn't cry. I didn't forgive. But I understood. When people fall from the pedestals they build, it isn't the height that breaks them, it's the silence afterward. A few days later, standing on the training field as the flag rippled in the wind, I whispered to no one in particular, "You ended yourself, Colonel. I just stopped carrying you." The sun caught the metal insignia on my shoulder, glinting briefly before fading into the ordinary light of day. And that was enough. Justice didn't roar. It stood still, tall, quiet, and complete. Spring rolled into summer with a gentleness I hadn't felt in years. The chaos had drained from my days, replaced by a kind of rhythm that didn't demand vigilance. At Fort Hood, the final paperwork for my promotion was completed, and for once there were no footnotes, no shadows attached to my name. I could finally sign Major Elise Hartman without the weight of lineage pressing on the ink. It was around that time I met her Sophie Lane, the 9-year-old daughter of Sergeant Claire Lane, who had served under my command during the 2022 flood rescue operation in Bastrop County. Claire had been the kind of soldier who didn't flinch under pressure, who volunteered for the hardest jobs and smiled through exhaustion. She'd died in an ambush overseas 8 months after that mission, leaving behind a daughter and a folded flag. Sophie had been staying with relatives near Waco, but they couldn't manage long-term care. When the base's Family Services office reached out asking if I'd consider a mentorship program, I said yes without thinking. It started small weekend visits, then weeknight dinners helping her with homework and listening as she told stories about her mom. She had the same calm intensity. Claire had eyes that absorbed more than they revealed. The first time she stepped into my apartment, she went straight to the framed photo on the shelf, my mother standing in her army dress blues. "Was she a soldier too?" Sophie asked. "She was," I said. "She never fought a war, but she raised one." Sophie grinned the kind of grin that carried both curiosity and unspoken understanding. Over the weeks, our routines became familiar. I taught her how to make her bed with hospital corners, how to fold her t-shirts into perfect rectangles, how to polish her shoes until they shone. She took to it like muscle memory, and I realized that discipline, when given with love, wasn't about control, it was about giving a child a sense of belonging. She'd sometimes ask about her mother, always quietly, always at night. "Was she brave?" She asked one evening as we sat on the porch, fireflies blinking across the lawn. "Braver than anyone I've ever known," I said. "She saved lives even when no one was watching." Sophie nodded, her eyes bright in the dusk. "You're brave too," she said after a pause. "Mom would like you." It hit me harder than I expected. That night, after she'd fallen asleep on the couch with her head resting on an old army blanket, I sat by the window, watching the moon rise over Killeen, feeling the strange pull of something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace, unearned but real. By early 2025, I'd made a decision. I filed the paperwork to adopt her. Brenda helped me navigate the legal maze. Avery wrote a recommendation letter, and within months, it was official. Sophie Lane Hartman. Seeing those 3 words together brought a sting to my eyes. I didn't just inherit a child. I inherited the chance to build something that wasn't broken. In June, we packed our lives into a U-Haul and drove to Austin. I'd taken a reassignment training coordination for the state's National Guard program, and the city felt like a rebirth waiting to happen. Our new apartment was small but bright with wide windows and a view of the Colorado River. Sophie picked the bedroom facing east so she could wake up with the sun. I let her. Each morning I woke at 5:30 for the gym, and when I came back, she'd already be awake sitting at the kitchen counter with a bowl of cereal and a sketch pad. Drawing your drills again, I teased once seeing her doodle a stick figure in uniform. Maybe, she said with a shy grin. Or maybe I'm drawing you. I leaned over and looked. The figure had short dark hair, a sharp salute, and a smile that actually looked warm. It was me, but not the version I'd been for most of my life. This one looked like someone who'd stopped running from ghosts. On Sundays, we'd drive out of town to the small cemetery near San Antonio where my mother was buried. Sophie liked to help me clean the gravestone, brushing away leaves and dust with her small hands. I always brought a single white rose, my mother's favorite, and a brass plate I'd had engraved last winter. It read, "Justice served, peace earned." Sophie traced the words with her fingertip once and looked up at me. "Is that about your dad?" she asked. I hesitated. "It's about all of us," I said finally. "About learning when to stop fighting." She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. Kids like her usually understood more than adults gave them credit for. That night back home, as she fell asleep to the hum of Austin's summer air outside, I sat on the balcony watching the city lights shimmer across the river. There was no noise in my head anymore, no imagined arguments, no ghosts demanding explanations. Just quiet, the kind that didn't feel empty. I realized then that peace wasn't something you earned through revenge. It was what remained when you stopped needing revenge to justify the pain. By autumn of 2025, life had settled into something that resembled grace. The days followed a steady rhythm: early morning workouts, school drop-offs, evening walks along the river, and in that rhythm I found the kind of calm the Army had never taught me. The city of Austin had a softness. Fort Hood never did a sense of movement without battle. Sophie thrived here. She joined a youth martial arts class, started painting again, and filled our apartment with drawings taped to the fridge, flags, helicopters, and sometimes just two stick figures standing under a blue sky holding hands. I didn't have to ask who they were. One night in late October, she sat beside me on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, watching an old black and white movie about women pilots during World War II. Halfway through, she asked, "Do you miss being a soldier?" I thought about it for a moment. Sometimes, I said, "But not the part you think." "Which part then?" "The part where you feel like what you're doing matters." I said, "The uniform doesn't give you that. The choices do." She nodded, processing that in the serious way only children can. "Then I think you still are a soldier," she said simply. I smiled, turning away so she wouldn't see the tears prickling my eyes. She was right, just not in the way I used to understand it. That winter, Brenda came to visit, bringing cookies and news from Fort Hood. "They finally removed his name from the training hall," she said carefully, "renamed it after Captain Lorraine Mendez." I took a slow breath, letting the information settle. There was no shock, no sting, just inevitability. "Good," I said. "It's time someone else's story stood there." Brenda smiled. "You've changed Elise. You used to need the last word." "Now I just need peace," I said, glancing toward Sophie's room where she was humming to herself. "Turns out it's quieter." When Brenda left, I sat at the dining table with a mug of tea, the city lights flickering outside. I thought about how my father used to believe legacy came from control, from being remembered. But the older I got, the more I understood that legacy wasn't about names on plaques. It was about what you left standing after you stopped fighting to be right. The next morning, Sophie woke early and ran into my room, holding a small paper she'd written at school. "It's for Veterans Day," she said proudly. The paper had a drawing of a folded flag and a few lines in uneven handwriting. My mom was brave. My new mom is brave too. She fights with calm, not guns. I couldn't speak. I just hugged her, pressing my face into her hair, breathing in the scent of crayons and shampoo. It was the kind of moment I'd spent years chasing without knowing it. That night, we went to the annual remembrance ceremony at Zilker Park. Candles floated on the water, each one representing a fallen service member. Sophie held mine carefully before setting it adrift. The flame wavered, then steadied, drifting across the reflection of the city skyline. "What do you think happens after they're gone?" she asked softly. I think I said watching the tiny light float farther away. "They rest when we stop carrying their mistakes." She looked up at me and nodded, the seriousness of her expression far older than her years. In that instant, I knew she would grow up strong, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. As winter gave way to spring again, our small apartment began to feel more like a home. I started painting the spare room, not army green, but pale blue, and hung photos of us at the lake at the memorial at home, cooking pancakes at dawn. Each photo felt like another layer of armor, not for defense, but for protection of something good. One Saturday, while Sophie was at a friend's birthday party, I drove alone to the old cemetery near San Antonio. The road was familiar, the air still. I brought 2 roses at this time, one for my mother, one for the man who had once tried to build an empire from control. I laid them both down one grave apart and whispered, "We're done fighting now. No anger, no forgiveness, just truth." The wind picked up brushing against the grass, and for a brief moment I imagined I heard their voices, not in conflict, but in silence. That night back in Austin, I sat on the balcony with Sophie's laughter echoing from inside the apartment. The skyline shimmered under the stars, alive with motion and sound. I took a slow breath, letting the peace fill me from the inside out. I wasn't anyone's daughter anymore, and I didn't need to be anyone's soldier. I was simply Elise teacher, mother, builder of something new. As I closed my eyes, I thought of my younger self standing in that banquet hall months ago, humiliated but unbroken. She had no idea that night would end the war that began her life. Now, sitting here with the echo of a child's laughter and the steady hum of a city that had no idea what I'd survived, I finally understood the meaning of victory. It wasn't about defeating someone else. It was about choosing to live when silence could have buried you. The next morning, Sophie left a note on the fridge, written in her looping handwriting, "Run time 0600. Don't be late." I laughed, grabbed my sneakers, and followed her into the sunrise. The air was cool, the path open. And for the first time, I wasn't running away from anything, I was running towards something. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It whispers. It doesn't come with applause or headlines. It arrives quietly like morning light slipping through the blinds after a long night of storms. I learned that the hard way. I used to believe justice meant confrontation, a grand declaration, a moment of vindication that made the world stop and look. But the truth? Justice isn't a spectacle. It's peace in motion. It's waking up one day and realizing the weight that used to crush your chest is gone. Not because someone handed you closure, but because you finally stopped asking for permission to breathe. There are moments I still replay the clatter of that bone on my plate, the sting of humiliation, the silence that followed. It used to haunt me. Now it feels like a different lifetime. The girl sitting there trying to swallow rage behind her uniform doesn't exist anymore. She became someone else. Someone who understood that power isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's about who stands still when the world tries to shame you into breaking. I think about the word revenge sometimes. People imagine fire and fury, someone falling to their knees while you watch. But the most powerful revenge is survival. It's building something beautiful out of the ruins of what tried to destroy you. For me, revenge looked like laughter echoing through a small Austin apartment, like Sophie's drawings on the fridge, like the rhythm of running shoes hitting the pavement at dawn. It looked like silence that didn't ache anymore. People always talk about forgiveness like it's the final chapter, but sometimes forgiveness isn't necessary for peace. Sometimes letting go doesn't mean excusing, it means refusing to let their story be the end of yours. My father believed legacy came from fear. My mother believed it came from sacrifice. I used to believe it came from approval. Now I know it comes from truth, the kind that doesn't ask to be believed. When I stand at Fort Hood now watching young officers train under the same flag that once overshadowed me, I don't feel bitterness. I feel clarity. The system didn't give me justice. It gave me a mirror. I looked into it and saw everything I refused to become. That's what redemption really is, not erasing the past, but owning your reflection without flinching. Sometimes people ask me if it was worth it exposing my own blood, walking away from the family name, living with the silence that followed. I never know how to answer. Worth is such a human thing measured in outcomes and approval. What I did wasn't about worth. It was about necessity. It was about finally choosing truth over lineage, dignity over obedience. Because if the price of belonging is your soul, you're not family, you're currency. And I stopped being currency the night I walked out of that banquet hall. I've learned that justice doesn't always come from courts or investigations. Sometimes it comes from simple moments saying no when you used to say yes, standing when you used to kneel, walking away when they expect you to crawl. Justice is the quiet echo that follows your footsteps when you finally leave the room they built to keep you small. If you've ever faced that choice between loyalty and truth, you know the ache I'm talking about. It's not anger, it's mourning. Mourning the version of you that still hoped they'd change. But when that ache fades, something extraordinary happens. You start living not out of fear, but from freedom. And freedom, once you taste it, is louder than revenge will ever be. Sometimes revenge isn't chaos, it's silence. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It hums beneath your skin, steady and unshakable. Maybe you've lived through your own kind of war, a betrayal, a silence, a wound no one saw. Maybe you've carried it for years, waiting for someone to see you, to believe you, to choose you. Let me tell you something: you don't have to wait anymore. You don't need an audience to validate your pain, and you don't need a villain to complete your story. You are enough as you are standing in your own light. And if you've ever had to choose between blood and truth, I want to know, what did you choose? Drop your thoughts below. Tell me what justice looked like for you, because every truth deserves its day, and maybe yours is waiting to be heard. Subscribe, because some stories don't end when the world goes quiet. They begin there.